Hi, my name is Becky Jennings, and this is the Responsible Parenting Podcast. I give you the transformational tools to stop reacting to your children in the moment and start responding with intention. Do you find yourself locked in a daily power struggle with your child? Do you fall back into old patterns like yelling or threatening just to stop the annoying behavior? Are you desperate to learn how to connect with your kids, set boundaries, heck, gain some cooperation? If this is you, you need to check out my community. Inside my community, you'll have access to my signature Strong-Willed Language course, where you learn how to regulate yourself, understand and speak your strong-willed kids' language to virtually eliminate the constant power struggles. You'll have access to my workshop library, giving you step-by-step strategies for sibling rivalry, listening, anger and aggression, emotional regulation, and more. You'll have weekly Q&A opportunities to get personalized answers on challenging situations. You'll get specific strategies for you based on exactly what's going on in your home. No umbrella strategy, no umbrella script, no bots. You'll get a personalized roadmap to support you. Plus, you'll get dozens of bite-sized lessons to regroup, stay on track, and stay motivated. It is time to stop walking on eggshells around your children and finally experience the release you are looking for. Join the community today and let's get started. Okay, here we go again. Sorry, everyone. I just had to restart the recording because I can't speak, apparently. My name is Becky. Welcome back to the Responsible Parenting Podcast. I am so excited to have Eileen Devine on here as a guest. Eileen is a licensed clinical social worker and founder of Brain First Parenting. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and 2 teenage children, one of whom lives with a serious brain-based difference. She has over 20 years of clinical experience, and for the last dozen of those years, she has focused solely on supporting parents who have kids with neurobehavioral conditions. She has an extensive catalog of work, and I am very excited to start this conversation with her because I feel like there's a challenge in parenting with parents who don't necessarily understand the brain differences that our children might be exhibiting, and we can take it very personally. So I love that you come to this table with a host of expertise on what to look for, how to work with your children, as opposed to feeling like we have to punish this out of them. And I'd really just love to dive in. So welcome to this conversation. Thank you for letting me flub several times and start over. What grace you have. So thank you. So welcome, Eileen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here, and I love talking about this topic. It's the work I do with parents. They are the most amazing people working really hard to try to figure out what is going to work for their child who is complex and more challenging than the average child. So my whole work is focused on helping them not work harder because they're already working so hard, but to take that energy and to put it somewhere different so that they can actually see some positive results come from that. And by positive results, I'm talking about those challenging behavioral symptoms, seeing them decrease in intensity and in frequency over time. That's the goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned before we hit record that you work with parents not just in the standard neurodivergent space. Like you have a wealth of knowledge on medical conditions that affect the brain and several different ways that, we were talking before this, that it's hard because if our child had asthma or if our child had diabetes, we wouldn't be trying to punish that out of them.
Right.
But when it's something that feels personal because it's behavioral, because it's aggressive, because it be like a lashing out or a meltdown that lasts much longer than expected, we feel like we have to take more punitive measures to change the behavior. But that's not how it works. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah. It makes all the sense in the world to me that the parents that I work with, when we begin working together, that's the only lens they have to see the behaviors through, because our society is deeply entrenched in a behavioral lens. And we want to make sense of this challenging behavior. And if the only lens we have to try to make sense of it tells us that behavior is always willful, it's always being done on purpose, it's always within one's control, then of course it feels personal. That's exactly what that lens is telling us. So, this alternative lens, which by the way is a lens that actually is the lens supported by neuroscience research, it's the lens that takes that research and helps us make sense of then our child's challenging behavioral symptoms. And you'll hear me refer to them as symptoms because that's what they are. It helps us understand that the brain and behavior are always connected. So if we have a child whose brain works differently, and I say child, but I work with parents who have teens, who have young adults. I mean, it really doesn't matter the age. If that individual's brain works differently, then it only makes sense that their behaviors would be different than what we expect. And sometimes those are, at best, exhausting and relentless, kind of annoying, irritating, but at worst, scary, right? Aggressive verbally or physically, and everything in between. And when we can understand that this is about their brain working differently, that it puts us on a different path. We respond differently. So you mentioned some of those physical diagnoses that kids have, and we would never think twice about accommodating those kids and what they needed to literally survive their day. A child with diabetes needs something very, very different than their peers to survive, right? To be safe in that environment. Um, when a child has a brain-based difference, the same ideas apply.
Yeah.
Their brain works differently. Their brain is a physical part of their body. They deserve accommodations that respond to those differences. But when the brain is invisible to us and we are entrenched in this behavioral lens where we see behaviors as willful, that's where we get all mixed up. And it
Yeah.
starts to feel very personal.
Absolutely. I've always been fascinated by the fact that we separate the brain and the body. We're like, we have to get out of the brain and back into the body, but the brain is 100% a part of the body. And I feel like we have just kind of separated out as two entities, and we don't realize how connected they are.
That's right. That's right. And again, the science supports that, right? And so when I have parents who want to be on board with this perspective that the brain and behaviors are connected, their child deserves accommodations, the behaviors are not about willfulness, they're about some skills deficits, cognitive skill deficits. If they meet this internal resistance to that idea because that behavior feels so intentional, then we go back to the science, right? That the body and mind are always connected and the behaviors are always connected to the mind. And so then we have to consider what's happening with this child's brain right alongside our consideration of the behavior. Because that tunnel vision is so easy to get, sucked into.
Yeah, I oftentimes talk about how it's like the power struggles are like an invitation to join the power struggle, right? And we have the choice as the parent whether or not to engage or accept that invitation. And it really takes a tremendous amount of mental fortitude and regulation on the parent's side to not take that as a personal barb or a personal attack in which we then join them in that power struggle or join them in their meltdown.
Yes.
Can you speak to like some of the ways in which you guide parents to a deeper understanding of their own triggers so that they can actually engage the situation? I don't want to say from like a bird's eye perspective, but like they're not so in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, they're not getting swept away by their child's dysregulation and behaviors. Yeah. And this is really why I only work with parents because to a certain extent, our kids are who they are. And so you mentioned like getting engaged in a power struggle, and many kids who literally do not have the skills and the ability to let go in an argument. It's because they don't have the cognitive flexibility skills that we would expect of a child of that age. And when we can see it from that perspective, like, they can't disengage. Like, as silly as this argument is, as unreasonable as they're being, their logic makes no sense. And yet they don't have the ability to think about it any differently. Then the alternative to that, the accommodation, is for us to then disengage and not meet their rigidity with our own rigidity. But as you mentioned, that's easier said than done. And there are reasons why that makes sense. When I work with parents and we talk about why are they triggered by this particular behavior or this particular characteristic, this particular aspect of their child's brain-based difference, and what values is it clashing with? What, old wounds are being kind of triggered?
Yeah.
Then the pa then the parent can meet their own experience with empathy and understanding and not feel like, "Why can't I do this?" Or, "Why am I always getting triggered?" Or, "Outside of the moment, I know how I wanna respond when I'm in a challenging moment, and I just can't do it. I can't make that leap. Why is that?" There are always reasons why, and it is as hard as you think it is. I say that to parents all the time.
Yeah.
Like, what we're doing is really trying to figure out our own internal experience so that we can stay regulated in that moment and be with our child in their distress. That challenging behavior that is so hard for our nervous system and is disrupting the entire environment, that's our child saying, "I'm in distress. Like, this is not working for me. I need you to be with me in this distress and help steady my nervous system."
Yeah.
If we can study our own nervous system and get that perspective, get a little bit of space between their behavior and our reaction, then this whole other world of possibilities opens up to us, right? But that attunement that I'm talking about, truly being with them in their distress, is really difficult unless it is something that you are mindful of, practicing, building your resilience outside of the moment to be able to do that inside of the challenging moment. So it's layered, it's complex, but it's absolutely doable. There's a lot of hope there for parents
Yeah.
who are in that struggle. Mhm.
Yeah, I can speak to that personally. My oldest son was recently diagnosed with ADHD, and for a large chunk of time, I mean, he's 7 now, almost 8, but he was undiagnosed. And so
Yeah.
we took a lot of these interactions very personally, and I was deeply triggered. And a large part of why I do what I do is because I didn't have the skills personally to manage these moments. Like, I was so dysregulated that I would very easily fall into the moment with him, and then I would essentially I didn't know what else to do, so I would use authoritarian tactics to
Yes.
shut down the moment because it was so overwhelming to my system, and it was just so constant that I
Yes.
didn't know how to figure this out. So I had to I literally was like, "I have to go back to school to learn this because I
Oh,
don't know how to do this." And I think even now that I have the diagnosis, that helps me soften and understand that it's not a personal thing, that this is actually how his brain is processing this moment.
yeah.
And at the same time, it still takes like a Herculean effort in my body
Yeah.
to not engage, to slow down, to try to seek to understand how I can support in those moments. And I think sometimes it's hard when parents are trying to do all of the things to accommodate, doing all of the things to meet the need, and it's still not changing. It's still
Mhm.
not changing the moment. Like, I can speak to it personally where I'll be like low and slow. I will be, asking curiosity questions. I'll be, trying to regulate myself. I'll be regulating for the both of us. And I'm still getting yelled at and I'm still getting the reaction. And sometimes parents and even sometimes I'm like, it's not working. And I think we can really want the immediate, like, we want our efforts to immediately impact the situation in
Yeah, of course.
a good way, and it doesn't sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah, there's several elements to that, right? I mean, that you're speaking to. One is, we're not in charge of our child's all their environments they're in all day, right?
Mhm.
And so often, I don't know if that's been the experience with your son, but oftentimes they'll be like in school, for example, and maybe not fully accommodated and understood and working harder than any of their classmates just to survive their day.
Mhm.
And maybe they do that pretty well. They don't have a lot of behavioral symptoms at school. Sometimes they do because it's too much.
Mhm.
But let's say they don't, and then they come home and their capacity is so low to regulate at all or to do even the simple tasks that require the most simple cognitive skills.
Mhm.
And when they reach that threshold, which happens very, very quickly then, they are dysregulated in a way that feels so extreme. It is extreme, right? It's like, why am I getting this reaction to this situation, right? And it's not just that situation that we're seeing the reaction to, it's the accumulation
Yeah.
of the cognitive fatigue and whatever might be happening.
Yeah.
But the other piece that you spoke to was the validation you received with his diagnosis. And I've had a lot of parents feel that same thing. And also, there is, I think, this false belief that the diagnosis will be everything, right? Like, oh, once I get this diagnosis, I will then have all the answers of how to help my child.
Yeah.
And while it does give a ton of information and maybe some medication support options, that kind of thing, it still comes back to understanding, how does your son with ADHD, how does his brain work that is different than a child of his age with the same diagnosis, right? Lots of overlap,
Yeah.
but there's still some unique differences. So that's the steep learning curve for a lot of parents.
Yeah.
But there's so much more hope in diving into that, deepening our understanding of our child through that lens, right?
Yeah.
Than kind of the power and control behavior modification techniques that we're told we should be using, right? And if we're not, we're bad parents, right? That we should
We're
be.
permissive. We're letting our kid run the show.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
Yeah. And I get, if I post anything about like how I worked with my child through a negotiation and I allowed him to speak his, voice and we worked together, I get a lot of frustrating comments saying like, "Oh, thanks a lot. Like we're going to have to deal with your kid later on in life and the world doesn't treat him like this." And it's hard because it's like I get the external perspective of having a neurotypical person join the workforce and
That's right.
do all these things. And yet if I jammed my square child into a circular hole, it wouldn't
Yes.
fit. And so it would be more problematic down the line if I'm not focusing on working with him now so he has a deeper understanding of how he processes things. And then
That's right.
take that from our safe central place of home and be like, okay, now that we know how this works internally, we can then expand that out to school. We can expand that out to a play date. We can expand that out to
That's right.
other teen environments. I mean, for instance, just a couple days ago, because we work on this so much, we work on regulating ourselves, and it's the vernacular in our house just by the nature of what I do.
Well,
And we had kind of a challenging situation, and he said to me, "It's not that I'm trying to yell at you. You're just the one person in front of me, and so I'm letting it out on you." And it was so sweet because he was like,
yeah.
"I'm not mad at you. I'm mad and you're in front of me." And
Yeah.
and then of course after he calmed down, he was like, "Can you cuddle me because I love you so much?" And it was one of those things,
Yes.
but it was he was able to say, and it was I was kind of impressed that he was like,
Yes.
"Not you. I'm not angry
right.
at you. You're in front of me."
That's right. That's right.
And
Yeah.
so we were able to have a conversation of, okay, when I am in front of you and you are feeling like this, what can we do instead? Like,
That's
what can we do instead? Can I take you to your room and you can yell at the pillow in front of you? Can you scream into something in front of you? Can you push against my hands? Because I am in front of you, but can you
Yes.
push and get that out? And so we started to try to figure out, and we haven't come to the exact conclusion because I feel like we need several tools in the toolbox. They're not
Well,
always going to be the exact, like, he's not always going to want to scream into a pillow. He's not always going to want to do these things. So we're kind of coming up with a myriad of positive and aggression releases and all of these different tactics and tools that he can use in the moment. But the fact that at 7, he was able to recognize, it's not you. I'm not angry at you. I'm angry
yes.
and you're in front of me.
Yeah. No, yeah, everything you talk about, what I hear is you're working so hard to build his skills, his self-regulation skills, his ability to inhibit his impulse. Like, I'm so angry, but you're not the target, so I'm not going to yell at you.
Yeah.
The ability to reflect on his behavior, the ability to then voice that and communicate it to you. All of those are cognitive skills that we expect kids to have in place at a certain age.
Yeah.
And some of our kids just don't. They need more time, they need more scaffolding, they need more support in growing those skills.
Yeah.
And so the person on the internet says to you, well, thanks a lot, whatever it might be. They have no appreciation and understanding that that is a skill and it takes support and it takes someone building it for then the child to grow up into this productive citizen, right? Who can consider other people and have a regulation skills to make it through frustrating events, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned in the introduction my 17-year-old and my 16-year-old, and my 17-year-old is what society would consider neurotypical. Like he's as neurotypical as they come. He's exactly what you expect. And I didn't have to think hard about building his skills. It just happened through like the very natural and predictable way that we parent, right?
Yeah.
And so I was an active parent with him, but I didn't have to do anything extra. It just, his development went as I expected it to.
Yep.
My 16-year-old, her development has been very, very, very different. And we are still intentionally sitting down with her after the challenging event has happened to help her build those skills, exactly the ones that you were talking about. The ability to connect the dots and see how her actions impact others. What could she have done differently? Lots of reteaching, knowing it's going to happen over the course of a long period of time for reteaching. It's not because she is a worse child than he is, right? It's not that he is a better child. They have brains that work very, very differently.
Yeah.
And so those skills development happen very, very differently, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's when we can see it as that, it's not about their character. They would be doing better if they could. It's about skill development. Then we're inclined to try to build the skills and support them in the skills, just as you described, versus punishing the behavior. How dare you yell at me? How could you do that? You are a bad child, right? That does nothing to build the skill and help them do something differently next time.
When dealing with frustrating behavior, yelling can quickly become our default way of handling things. But since you're listening to this podcast, I know you're looking for a better way. That's why I created my free guide to help you get out of the yelling cycle. This 6-part free guide gives you the foundational information to start breaking the toxic yelling cycle. Click the link in my show notes to get your free guide today. This might be the hardest cycle to break as parents, but I have your back, and together we can change the way we respond.
You know, I've been studying obviously a lot since the diagnosis, reading as much as I can, consuming journals and medical papers and things like that, just trying to understand it a little bit more. And something I came across, which I found to be really, really eye-opening for me, is that there is a challenge with both hindsight and foresight. So we're not learning from our past mistakes, and we're not thinking about how this current moment could impact a future consequence or something,
That's right.
you know, that could really impact. So it's like these children are like living in the here and now.
That's
Not having learned from an experience that might have just happened,
That's
or not even thinking about how it could potentially future impact them. And I found that to be one of the clearest understandings for me about how we as a society expect people to develop. We expect to learn if we were late to work or late to school, how that impacted us. And we expect to have this understanding of, if we want to achieve this goal, we might have to pull back here, we might have to adjust here. And that's just not what we experience. And that really was super supportive for me to understand and to read of, they live in the here and now. And so when we're in the heat of the moment and we're in a challenging situation, I can't be like, how did you not just learn from this experience? Because that's only going to carry shame and for all of the things. It's the after the fact. Okay, this happened again. And it's also like the awareness that we have to have as the parent of kind of seeing the ramp up and building the scaffolding around it to be like, okay, I see this is about to happen again, kind of being their hindsight and foresight for them.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
You speak to that of how you can support parents in that observation, and then like some of the things maybe are what you've noticed to be, aside from just the parent learning how to regulate their own nervous system,
Yes.
some scaffolding that helps a parent walk their kid through these challenging moments.
Yeah. 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 So there's always patterns. And so you're describing some of those patterns like, oh, I've noticed that this applies to my child over and over and over again. I see it. And when we start to see the patterns, then we can proactively accommodate to try to prevent whatever happened before
Yeah.
from happening, right? Really save them from themselves in some ways. If they are highly impulsive, they can't remember when mom said, even just a few hours ago, if you do this again, this is what's going to happen. That's why consequences truly do not work, right? And when I have parents say, like, oh my gosh, how do you parent them? Right? Because in our traditional parenting lens, we're like, give a consequence. They need to learn. Well, that isn't how they learn. And so your question of, well, how do we scaffold and learn? One is outside of the moment, taking some time to look at that pattern and figuring out where did things start to get tricky? And what was the task or the expectation that I had for my child that things started to get tricky? They started to be resistant, defiant, started to amp up in their aggressive behavior, whatever it might be, sassiness, right? And is it possible that I was asking them to do something that they couldn't do, that they truly did not have the skills to do in that moment? And if I can consider that and think about, well, what might I do next time to give them some extra support in that area with that task or expectation? Or do I need to adjust it? Is it something that needs to be adjusted because I now see that's not really appropriate for them? Even though based on their chronological age, it would be, based on where they are as an individual child, it doesn't really make sense to do that, right? So that's the first piece. The second piece that you're speaking to is what I call circling back, and it's having these conversations with our child to help with the intention of helping build their skills. So it's not about punishment. It's about understanding, they're lagging behind in these skills. That's why we got ourselves into this situation. And I want to go over it with them to help them build their skills. How does it feel to be that other person? What sort of repairs need to be made with your brother or sister, for example? How can we do that, right? So you do get to express your concerns, but it's in the spirit of helping them connect the dots, seeing what led to what, and then doing what comes next. That can be a really hard conversation for kids to tolerate if the pattern has been, I did this thing and I get in trouble. I did this thing and I get in trouble. And that's been the cycle. So being patient with the process and knowing they're going to have to start to trust that you're coming to them leading with empathy, understanding they would have done better if they could. And I really want to help you figure this out so that we can do better next time.
Yeah, I find that that's a really tricky spot, especially if you've come at it for so long from a punitive punishment standpoint. The building of that trust that this conversation isn't a lecture to because you're in trouble. This
Okay.
conversation is really just trying to figure out what we can do together, how we can work together. And, we've talked to my son about how we're removing punishments as a means of behavioral change. And a couple of weeks ago, he was like, punishments just don't even work. He was like, it does. He even said, he goes, it does nothing to change my behavior.
Because he doesn't need to be motivated to
It's
act
not a
better.
motivator at all.
That's right.
And I think one thing that is also hard in this space is that sometimes the slow, empathetic, like, I understand, I can see you're really angry. I can see this is happening. Sometimes almost triggers the opposite response in the child. Like they almost get angrier or more defensive. And I wonder if you can speak to me what is happening in that moment because parents are just like, I'm doing the things
Right.
that.
Right. Yeah. And this is where, when I talk about knowing your individual child is so important. If we think about what state our child is from this nervous system perspective, when they are in that very agitated, aggressive, whatever, dysregulated state, they're in this protective mode where any kind of communication from us could be seen as threatening. So I always say, talk very little or not at all. Think of it as using your nervous system to communicate with their nervous system, which helps parents quiet themselves. Try to stay as close as possible, but in a way that's non-threatening. So no eye contact. Maybe you're lower than they are on the ground. They want you out of their room. That's fine. Sit outside their door and let them know that you're right outside the door.
Yeah.
And give them food and water, right? Even if it's something that you would rather they not eat, but you know it'll get something in their system. So focusing on that nervous system stability, that conversation that I talked about with circling back is way, way, way after the fact. If the parent feels any sort of residual agitation, resentment, don't do it. It is not the time because you're dysregulated and that is contagious, right? If you know your child is still just simmering, don't do it. It's not the time. It can be the next day. That's okay. You won't lose the opportunity. And as you get better with this pattern and are more consistent with circling back, using your co-regulation in that presence in the moment, circling back afterwards to do the teaching and instilling our values, your child will be ready for that more quickly, right? I have times where my 16-year-old is ready to circle back with me before I'm ready, right?
Yeah.
And it's been after years and years and years and years of this being the way that we repair it and that we mend situations after they've happened. But that other key piece of leading with empathy, like you mentioned it, I understand. Like, for example, I know that last night when you broke the TV, that you would have never done that if you weren't having a really hard time. And I was just so heartbroken as your mom to see that you were having such a hard time that that's what happened. That must have been terrible for you. Some parents are like, I cannot imagine having that approach to my
Yeah.
child breaking the TV, right?
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
Because that's not the lens that we're taught to see our child through, right? So I say to parents, lots of self-compassion, lots of grace as you're making this shift.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen overnight.
No, and I can speak to the fact that it absolutely does not happen overnight.
Yeah.
And this is my job too. You know what I mean? It's like it's also my job and I am faced with these challenges every single day. And I think part of the challenge is like I have a younger so my ADHD son is the oldest and then I have a younger child as well who from all we can see is very neurotypical.
Mhm.
I think it's challenging sometimes in those moments when there's like a sibling moment or a retaliation against the younger child, and the younger
Yeah.
child is crying or has been just recently hurt. And it feels so much like if we don't address it right now,
That's right.
our child is going to feel like they got away with it. Feel like, and we feel manipulated in the moment because we like it makes sense to me that we're not addressing it at the height of the moment because there's no learning done when we're dysregulated and they're dysregulated.
Right.
We're almost like that Peanuts character, like that teacher that's like, wah, 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 like
That's
nothing
right.
heard.
That's right.
And at the same time, I think we feel this panic that if we don't address it in the moment, then they got away with it. And
That's
we
right.
can't let this behavior happen.
That's right.
How do you advise parents, like, in the moment when maybe something physical has happened or maybe something aggressive has happened,
Yes.
how to keep one sibling safe and also accommodate the needs of the different in learning?
Yeah. Well, safety is always first. I mean, that has to be addressed, right?
Yeah.
And it makes sense that we would get triggered and that our fight or flight system would cause us to move forward and respond in a way that maybe we regret later. Maybe we feel like, oh, I wish I could have responded with less words or less like physical force in that moment, but that took over. So knowing that fear getting in the way of us being able to respond how we would ideally like to is very normal. Lots of self-compassion, lots of grace. And it's about, well, what can I do to do this better next time or in a way that is more in alignment with how I want to be. So safety first. The other piece, part of this climbing the steep learning curve is back to it over and over again, that this way of parenting is not an excuse for behavior that is not good or right or appropriate. It is not about that. It is about understanding what the behavior is about. that it is a symptom of something else happening. What is that something else? Getting curious about that and responding to that so that your wisdom, your words, your energy actually have an impact, right?
Right.
That's the scenario that you describe. So many parents that I work with find themselves in that position. And what I worry about with them is burnout and just chronic fatigue and blocked care, not being able to even draw upon any compassion for their child after years and years and years of this
Yeah.
because they are working so hard to calm things down in their home and it's not working,
Yeah.
right? Because it's a constant reaction cycle of responding to fear, responding to fear, responding to fear, or whatever other emotion might bubble up, and not truly getting to addressing why does this pattern keep happening? Why is my child in such distress? This is the lens shift, in such distress that they're chronically treating their sibling in a way that's really unsafe, right? And working, spending all the energy focusing on that point so that over time, the intensity and the frequency of those escalated behaviors, that aggression towards their sibling, dissipates. Well, that is possible,
Yeah.
but it's really figuring out where to put the energy that's different than where most parents are beginning right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, because the behaviors are so frequent often and repetitive, it can be just an endless, exhausted
Yeah.
cycle of stepping in, taking one child to this side of the room, the other side, trying to, facilitate problem solving, trying to do the active and reflective listening, trying to lead with empathy, trying to not, it's just like it can be, and we know that siblings fight like up to 8 times an hour. So
Yeah.
it can be really challenging when you're just trying to quote unquote, you know, do it in the not traditional way, and the non-authoritarian way. And if you're just baseline building these skills, it's really, really hard.
Yes.
Really hard.
Yes, that's why I say to parents, it is as hard as you think it is.
Yeah.
And also what um the possibilities that await you on the other side
Yeah.
of this shift, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot to be hopeful about there. But your child is complex. And part of this is accepting, easing into the acceptance of who they are, that they are complex, that they have a very fragile nervous system and a brain that experiences the world very differently, a world that's not set up for them, right? So that is true. And also, you can still experience joy in parenting them and delight in being with them, right? Like, what an idea. Many parents I work with are like, I can't imagine. So that's where we begin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like through all the studying and everything, the reason a lot of us get into this is to fix our child.
Mm.
And we realize, hopefully, partway through the process, that our child doesn't need to be fixed.
Yeah,
That a large part about this is just we've never been trained this way. We've never learned these skills,
that's right.
been conditioned to react to behaviors as opposed to learning what the behavior is communicating, as opposed to learning why it hurts us the way it hurts us. Um, you know, the more and more I do this work, I realize that how I respond to it dictates how long it goes.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, which is also really hopeful, right? Because then
100%. It's like
yeah,
you can only really truly like our neurodivergent children,
yeah,
they show us that we cannot control anything. Like
that's
it
right.
is like we cannot control a single thing. And so it is wonderful to realize like, oh, I get to control myself. And
Right, which
that,
truly is the only thing
yeah,
we can
exactly.
want control over. Yes.
Exactly.
Wow. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's why I started this work as well, is my kids are only 15 months apart, but I found what I was doing with my son that was working just fine. Did not work with my daughter at all. But once I found this information, which was, of course, life changing for her, for me, for our family, I was very frustrated that parents like you and I weren't given this information immediately
Yeah.
alongside our child's diagnosis. Or we go to the pediatrician and we say, I don't know what's going on, but my child is like super challenging, like way beyond anything you would expect at this age. And for the pediatrician to say, this is the information you're missing. This is the information that you need to have, right? Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So we're just left to figure it out on our own and
yeah.
all. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. Any final thoughts, any final words you'd like to share?
Just for the parents that are listening and working so hard to support their complex child, knowing that there's lots of other parents like you that are working just as hard to see their child through this very empathetic, research-based, science-based lens.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling alone and isolated, to know that there's many, many other parents out there walking alongside you, trying very hard to do the same thing.
Yeah. And where can listeners find you and follow along or?
Wow. So it's Eileen Devine, Brain First Parenting, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and I have a podcast, Brain First Parenting with Eileen Devine. Those are probably the best places to find me and find my work, the work that I do with parents.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I think this is going to be a lot of support for a lot of parents. Maybe just even the fact that they feel heard for probably the first time. So thank you for sharing all this information. I truly appreciate the work you're doing.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to the Response Able Parenting Podcast. If you like what you heard, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. If you know someone who would benefit from this podcast, I'd be honored if you'd share this episode with them. Until next time, know that you are enough, you are capable, you've made it through all of your hardest days, and we will keep growing on this parenting journey together. This podcast was produced by Kim Kelty and myself, Becky Jennings, and edited by the Kelty Method, Branding and Podcasting.